Good evening, everybody, and thank you for coming. As you can see, I'm not Alan Townsend. My name is Paula Varsano. I teach classical Chinese poetry in the Department of East Asian Languages and Cultures, and I'm standing in tonight for Alan, who sends his regrets and who is not feeling well tonight. So we're honored to be hosting Alberto Manguel, and thank him for giving us of his time and his energy. And now a little quote that I'll bet some of you will recognize. I think we ought to read only the kinds of books that wound and stab us. If the book we're reading doesn't wake us up with a blow on the head, what are we reading it for? So that it will make us happy? Good Lord, we would be happy precisely if we had no books. And the kind of books that make us happy are the kind we could write ourselves if we had to. But we need the books that affect us like a disaster, that grieve us deeply, like the death of someone we loved more than ourselves, like being banished into forests, far from everyone, like a suicide. A book must be the axe for the frozen sea inside us. That is my belief. That was Kafka. Another quote. I've always imagined that paradise will be a kind of library. Unsurprisingly, that's Borges. I hope our guest today, Alberto Manguel, will not take it amiss to be gathered together with these two great forebears. Born in Buenos Aires, raised in Tel Aviv and Buenos Aires, in English and in German, a long-time Canadian resident, and now living in France amidst 30,000 books. I want to hear about that. Alberto Manguel was early in his life, his late teens, I believe, marked forever by having had the enviable job of reading aloud to a blind Borges. Perhaps he came to his love of literature and of the sound of words from that experience, or perhaps he went to that experience already formed in that love. In well over 25 books, Mr. Manguel has been our surrogate reader, erecting a paradise on this earth of his readings of books and the world that created them. He has done this in lucid, precise, tasteful, eloquent prose that makes reading a joy and keeps the art of reading alive in a period in which that art is being threatened by all sorts of distractions. Most important of all, perhaps, Mr. Manguel has transmitted to us his passion for the life of words in books like A History of Reading, which is just republished, Reading Pictures, A History of Love and Hate, the novel Stevenson Under the Palm Trees, The Library at Night, and the 2015 Curiosity. George Steiner has called Mr. Manguel the Casanova of reading. For him, reading defines our species. In his words, we come into the world intent on finding narrative in everything: the landscape, the skies, the faces of others, the images and words that our species creates. Words, he writes, in spite of everything, lend coherence to the world and offer us a few safe places as real as paper and as bracing as ink to grant us room and board in our passage. With that, please welcome Alberto Manguel.
Many thanks. Well, I'm very honored to be here. I've come to Berkeley with an invitation of the Codex Foundation, but then was invited as the best of parties to other parties, the Book Club of California, and now here to this Townsend Center. So thank you very much for the introduction, Paula. Paula quoted Kafka and then Borges, so from the sublime to the ridiculous, I will talk to you tonight about a very mysterious for us in the West, script of knots. I've titled my talk, Tongue Tied in Knots. And I will try to illustrate it. Alice in Wonderland says that what is the use of a book without pictures or conversations? So we'll have the conversations and we'll have the pictures. So we'll start with this one. Aha, first picture. All writing is the art of materializing thought. When a word is written, wrote St. Augustine, it makes a sign to the eyes whereby that which is the domain of the ears enters the mind. Writing belongs to this group of conjuring arts related to the visualizing and transmission of ideas, emotions, and intuitions. Painting, singing, reading are all part of this peculiar human activity born of the capacity to imagine the world in order to experience it. On an inconceivable afternoon a very long time ago, a remote ancestor of ours realized for the first time that he or she did not need to perform an action in order to know it, that the action performed itself in the mind, and that it could be observed, explored, reflected upon in a time and space of its own making. Imagining something led to naming that something, that is to say, translating the visualized something into an equivalent of sound, so that the enunciation of the sound might conjure back the image of the thing like a witch's charm. In some societies, the sound was given in turn a material representation, markings in a handful of clay, notches in a piece of wood, designs on a polished stone, scribbles on a page. Experience of reality could now be encoded by the tongue or the hand and decoded through the ear or the eye, like an illusionist showing a flower in a box, then causing it to disappear, then bringing it back again in front of the public's astonished gaze. Our ancestor made it possible for us to perform magic. Now, we readers belong to the societies of the written word, and as every member of such societies must, but not all do, we try to learn the code by which their fellow citizens communicate. Not every society, of course, requires the visual encoding of its language. For many, sound is enough. The old Latin tag, scripta manent verba volant, which is supposed to mean what is written endures, but what is spoken vanishes, is obviously not true in oral societies where the meaning might be what is written remains dead on the page, but what is said out loud has wings and flies. That is also the meaning readers discover. Only when read do the written words come to life. I'll just keep showing you pictures. In 1976, the psychologist Julian Jaynes suggested that when language was first developed in humans, it manifested itself in oral hallucinations. Oral, A-U-R-A-L. The words were generated by the right hemisphere of the brain, but they were identified by the left as coming from somewhere in the world outside us. According to Jaynes, when written language was invented in around the third millennium before our era, we heard the written signs as voices which perhaps we attributed to communicative gods, and only in the first millennium before our era did these voices become internalized. The earliest readers may have experienced a hallucinatory sense of sound, so that the words read by the eyes acquired in the reading a physical presence in the ear, a second reality outside the mind that echoed or mirrored the primary reality of the written word. Certainly the passage from spoken to written language was less an improvement in quality than a change in direction. Plato invented a myth in which the Egyptian god Thoth offered the pharaoh the gift of language, but the pharaoh explained to the god that he was obliged to refuse it because if people learned to write, they would forget to remember. Plato failed to mention, because it didn't suit his story, that thanks to writing, speakers were now able to overcome the limitations imposed by time and space. They would not need to be present in order to deliver their speeches, and across the centuries, the dead would be able to converse with the living. Less immediate, less corporeal, less reactive than the art of speech, the art of writing simultaneously strengthened and diminished the power of the wordsmith. This is, of course, true of every contraption or tool in whatever craft we use. Chesterton defined a chair as an apparatus of 4 wooden legs for a cripple with only 2. Written language, serving a variety of purposes and obeying a diversity of aesthetic norms, gradually developed almost everywhere in the world. Sumeria and Babylon, Egypt and Greece and Rome, China and India developed their own scripts, which in turn inspired those of other cultures in Southeast Asia, in Ethiopia and Sudan, among the Inuit people. Other peoples, however, imagined different methods to lend words material visibility. In many parts of the world, there is an art of writing that involves not penned or incised markings, but other semantic signs, for instance, strips of bamboo in southern Sumatra, message sticks among the Australian Aborigines, wreath of twigs in the Torres Straits Islands, wampum belts among the Iroquois, wooden Lukasa boards among the Luba people of Zaire. It follows then that there must be something equivalent to an art of typography for each of these other forms, each with its particular aesthetics and readability. These typographies, for want of a better word, may not be used in printing, but they affect and shape the conveying of meaning through words in much the same way as Garamond or Bodoni affects and shapes a text written in English, Italian, French. Now begins the story. In the year 1606, there appeared in Madrid a curious book titled Comentarios Reales. Let me go to the next image. The title played on both meanings of the Spanish word real, royal, and existing in reality, because these comentarios purported to be the true chronicles of the royal Incas of Peru. The author, born of a Spanish captain and an Inca princess, signed his book Inca Garcilaso de la Vega, thus acknowledging both lineages. He had been brought up by Spanish tutors in his father's house in Cusco, who taught the boy Latin grammar and physical sports, but also by relatives of his mother who taught him Quechua, the language of Peru. At the age of 21, he traveled to Spain, where he began his literary career translating the dialogues of love of the Spanish Neoplatonist Leon Hebreo. Keen on being recognized as a true historian of the Inca culture, he titled the second part of his Inca Chronicles, which appeared 11 years after the first, Historia General del Perú, General History of Peru. In the Comentarios Reales, the Inca Garcilaso gives a detailed account of the customs, religion, and government of the Incas, as well as of their language, oral and written. One chapter describes the system of quipu, knot in Quechua language, which served, the author tells us, essentially as a counting device. To make quipu, the Incas used threads of different colors, braided and knotted and sometimes fixed onto a cane. Colors symbolized categories: yellow for gold, white for silver, red for warriors, and so on. And the knots followed the decimal system up to 10,000. Things could not be distinguished by their color, were placed in order of value, from the most important to the least. So we have here different hierarchies to represent value and meaning. For example, if weapons were listed, first would come the noble ones, such as spears, followed by bows and arrows, clubs and axes, slingshots, and so on. The lists set down on the quipu were entrusted to a registrar, or public reader, if you will, called quipu camaya, which means he who looks after the accounts, an accountant. To keep this power from being abused, and this is very interesting in the Inca form of government, the Incas made certain that every town, however small, had a large number of these accountants, so that, as Garcilaso tells us, they would either all have to be corrupt or none at all. This is a system that failed Wall Street. The Inca Garcilaso de la Vega died in Córdoba, in Spain, in 1616, having tried to reconcile the tenets of the all but vanished culture of his maternal ancestors with the dominant ones of his father's lineage. Now, almost a century later, in 1710, Raimondo di Sangro, later Prince of Sansevero, was born in Torre Maggiore, heir to a couple of the most prestigious families of the Kingdom of Naples. And we will see how these two characters relate, Garcilaso and the Prince of Sansevero. Now let's go to another image so you don't get bored. Sansevero did so many extraordinary things in the course of his 60-year life that it is almost impossible to name them all. He began his kaleidoscopic career as a military historian, beginning a universal dictionary of the art of war, unfortunately left unfinished when he reached the letter O. His interest in warfare led to his experimenting with gunpowder and pyrotechnics, and in this field he discovered how to achieve several hitherto unobtainable tones of green in firework displays: sea green, bright emerald, and he says the color of fresh grass. These discoveries, in turn, allowed him to invent what he called pyrotechnic theaters, in which the fireworks created successive scenes depicting temples, fountains, intricate landscapes, we have a composer of opera here who could take up Sansevero's suggestion and create a fireworks spectacle of music. The incandescent set designs inspired the prince, already a voracious reader, an interest in designing of printing and casting type. And always ingenious, he invented a single passage method for printing colored images on copper sheets that anticipated Alois Senfelder's lithography by half a century. And the career goes on. In 1750, Sansevero set up in his Neapolitan palazzo the first printing press in the Kingdom of Naples, with characters designed by the marvelous Nicolas Komarek and Nicola Persico under his supervision. Now, the ecclesiastical authorities, always present at the time, disapproved of Sansevero's publications. They found them heretical. And as a result, 2 years later, they ordered the press to be closed. It's interesting how the history of our intellectual pursuits runs parallel with a shadow history of censorship. Every time we create something, we have somebody who wants to silence it. And this has existed from the moment that in the Genesis story we tried to build a tower to reach the heavens. And the first censor up there decided to find a way to stop us. To circumvent the proscription, Sansevero cunningly donated the press and the type to His Majesty Charles III, who, on the basis of the gift, created the Royal Printing House of Naples. But the press was not Sansevero's last enterprise. The manuscripts and foreign books he perused for possible publication led to an interest in the arts of alchemy. The alchemical experiments and the creation of life inspired him to build exquisite automata. The building of automata took him into a study of the technology of machines and the science of metals, minerals, and chemistry. In 1753, an accidental fire in Sansevero's lab took 6 hours to extinguish. As a result, the prince announced that he had discovered a lamp of perpetual or eternal light, fused by powdered human skull mixed with gunpowder. Don't try this at home. Other casual combinations led to new and prodigious inventions: a water-resistant cloth, a tapestry not of woven but superimposed threads that resembled an oil painting in the perfection of its detailed depictions, a linen that would not wrinkle, long before nylon, a paper made of vegetable silk ideal for drawing and writing, a method for cleaning copper that did not require burnishing and left no scratches, a technique for producing brass sheets thinner than any other produced until then, a procedure for making translucent porcelain and the slimmest possible crystal, a system for coloring glass without having to heat it, indelible pastel crayons that required no fixing, an artificial wax and oleohydric colors that resembled oil paints but needed no previous preparation of the canvas or wood. He also invented a machine for desalinizing seawater and another for making false agates and lapis lazuli, with which he tricked many a reputable jeweler. He devised a method for hardening marble. This is very interesting because we can see even today some of these objects. He devised a method for hardening marble which allowed sculptors to chisel it down to unheard of thinness so that they could now create transparent veils and delicate lacework in stone. You have probably seen these figures that are covered with what seems like a veil, sculpted in marble, and they're incredibly effective. He also built two anatomical machines still visible in the Sansevero family crypt in Naples that reproduce the circulatory system of a man and a woman from the heart to the tiniest capillaries. Among his most fanciful creations were a table that laid itself for dinner without the need of servants, and a water chariot adorned with horses made of cork that could cover a fair distance through the waves of the Bay of Naples. Obviously, people began to suspect that Sansevero was assisted in his inventions by the devil himself. It was rumored that he had brewed a substance akin to blood, and also that he had been able to bring river crabs back to life after they had been burned to cinders in the hearth. It was said that, like Paracelsus, he could make a rose bloom again from its ashes. Neapolitans later believed that the prince had taken his own life after instructing his servants to perform a resurrection procedure which his wife, alerted to the sacrilege, had piously interrupted. The corpse had barely the time to step out of its coffin before it uttered a hideous shriek and crumbled to mortal dust. I was trying to find if Edgar Allan Poe was aware of the Prince of Sansevero. You remember his story about Monsieur Valdemar, who undergoes this same kind of resurrection with one of the most disgusting endings of any horror story I know. Among the books issued from Sansevero's press in the year of its founding in 1750, perhaps the most curious one was the apologetic letter composed by Sansevero himself and accompanied by superb colored plates. I'll show you some more. The subject of the letter was the quipu system of the ancient Incas. Our investigative prince, interested as he was in everything, came to know about the quipu through the books of the Inca Garcilaso, but also through a Jesuit who had been in Peru and written an Inca handbook illustrated with several colored sketches of a variety of knots accompanied by explanations of their meanings. And these are some, for instance. I'll show you another one. I have had to reproduce the pages by half because they're very long. They fold out of the book. They're marvelously printed. But Sansevero not only saw these illustrations, but he also saw the real thing, an original quipu brought from the Spanish colonies. The books and the quipu had come into the hands of a Jesuit father who had been in the New World and had sold the lot to the prince in 1745. 2 years later, try to follow the story because it's a little complicated, but really interesting. 2 years later, in 1747, a French blue stocking, Madame Francoise de Graffigny, following the vogue of epistolary novels begun with Montesquieu's Persian letters, had published Letters of a Peruvian Lady. Now, Graffigny's novel is a love story that concerns two aristocratic Incas, Zilia and Aza, who are engaged to be married. But poor Zilia is kidnapped by Spanish soldiers, and to let her betrothed know of her sad fate, she secretly sends him letters from prison in the form of knotted quipu, using a stock of colored threads that she always carried with her. Poor Zelia is forced to accompany her raptors back to Europe, where she continues to tie her knots, but she is unable to get them to Asa far across the sea. In the end, her stock of threads runs out, and this is the interesting part. She must learn the European art of writing in ink in order to carry on her lovesick correspondence. Now, this is the only instance I know of a passage in fiction depicting the learning of writing by someone outside a literate society. So everything has to be explained. The set of symbols that we take for granted, even if we can't read, and what is paper, what is ink, etc., etc. Sansevero was convinced that an efficient writing system based on knots had indeed existed in the Inca Empire, but in the Europe of the Enlightened, such non-European inventions so different from the Western models were regarded with more than skepticism. Anxious to engage in a debate on the authenticity and efficacy of the quipu in which he believed, and unable or unwilling to find among the published detractions a propitious text, Sansevero invented a critical response to the novel of Madame de Graffigny, attributing the text to a friend, the Duchess of S. ... And thus armed, Sansevero proceeded to debate the non-existent tract in a Borgesian literary gesture, ending the apologetic letter with an entreaty to the Duchess of S., who, poor thing, had never written the book, to become herself a story weaver, an accountant, and write her next book in the knotted script of the quipu. So let me sum this up. Madame de Graffigny had written a novel in which she theorized that with the quipus you could write texts. The novel was criticized, but Sansevero couldn't find in the criticism anything strong enough to argue against. So he invented a text that argued against Madame de Graffigny, and he defended Madame de Graffigny against the invented text. I think that every scholar should learn from this. If you don't find the text that you can work on, invent it. Sansevero's entangled argumentation in the apologetic letter, full of distracted asides, those that in that wonderful 18th century style, asides composed in a deliciously convoluted prose, tackles among its many subjects the universal origins of language, the invention of writing, the hidden truth of the Bible, the meaning of the mark of Cain, the ancestral custom of poets in the Inca Empire, and the detailed analyses of certain quipu texts in the author's possession, a copy of one, and this is remarkable, which had been quoted and translated in Inca Garcilaso's book. It's as if this manuscript made of knots, to call it something, had been also found by Garcilaso and then made its way to Naples, where the Jesuit priest had sold it to the Prince of Sansevero. So what I have been showing you are reproductions of Sansevero's book. So he depicts all these quipus. I'll show you more. But you can see that he shows you the knots, he shows you the colors, and he attributes letters to indicate the pronunciation of the words. In order to explain his theory, Sansevero began with the assumption that the quipu were readable. That is to say, that they were constructed according to a code that allowed both words and numbers to be transmitted by means of the system of colored knots. Anticipating Champollion's methods by half a century, Sansevero began by identifying in the quipu some 40 key words common in the Quechua language, such as vassal, princes, divine creator, and the like, that the Quechua poets would have dictated to the weavers in charge of knotting the quipu. For these basic concepts, Sansevero believed he could identify certain underlying quipu patterns equivalent to linguistic signs. Let me give you a couple of examples because all this is quite complicated. The Quechua word for divine creator is Pachacamac. According to Sansevero, the core sign, the core knot then, would have been a yellow knot, symbolizing the creator's eternal light. This central knot would contain 4 threads of different colors: red for fire, blue for air, brown for earth, emerald for water. However, the same central sign could stand for the word sun, yunti in Quechua, and though it would dispense with the 4 colored threads, it would include several yellow threads, knotted from the inside out. I know that these descriptions are complicated, but no more complicated than if you had to describe to someone who knew nothing of the written alphabet how a word is constructed and how the letters are formed. Another example, the word for ñandú, you know, the small South American ostrich-like bird, is suri in Quechua. In the quipu, it would be represented by the same knots as those depicting a human being, but the distance between the knots would be greater, indicating the bird's long neck. So there is a combination of hieroglyphic writing, but also phonetic, because as you will see, the knots also represent sounds. According to Sansevero, the Inca poets would have been able to write all other words they required by dividing them into syllables and looking for corresponding syllables in one of the basic words. Smaller knots were then made following the one for the key word, thus indicating which syllable was meant. So, for instance, if a word began with the syllable su, the knots for suri would be tied, followed by one smaller knot, indicating that you shouldn't read the whole suri, but just the su. Then if the second syllable of the word were mac, the knot for pachacamac would be tied, followed by 4 smaller knots to indicate that that was the syllable you wanted. The resulting word is sumac, the first word of the poem that Garcilaso included in the Comentarios Reales. On February 29th, 1752, the Augustinian Domenico Giorgi entered the apologetic letter into the Catholic Index of Forbidden Books, branding the text a Kabbalistic production that mocked the true faith. Father Giorgi, and I love the fact that this Kabbalistic interpretation is no more ludicrous than what Sansevero was trying to build. If Father Giorgi traced Sansevero's interpretation and defense of the quipu to the pagan hieroglyphs of Egypt, the Pythagorean numbers of the Rosicrucians, and the Sephirot of the Jews, the Kabbalists, according to Father Giorgi, maintained that God is our brother and compared the Almighty and his Adam to knots that are bound on the same piece of string. Voila. The Quipu, argued Father Georgi, were the new world representation of this horrendous blasphemy. A year later, Sansevero published a plea in defense of his apologetic letter, an apologetic letter. His arguments proved unconvincing, and the Holy See maintained its interdiction. On March 22nd, 1771, Raimondo di Sangro, Prince of Sansevero, died in Naples, his work unredeemed. I'll show you some more images. Let's see. Right. And now, this is a history of the Incas that shows you some images of, first of all, these accountant storytellers weaving, knotting the quipus on a string. There is another person holding the quipus, same here. And in the last image, it shows a reference to quipus and accounting. And this is, you see, is from the Nueva Crónica en Buen Gobierno of Felipe Guzmán de Ayala. And I will finally show you this our image. Yes. So this is a real quipu that came to Europe and is preserved in Berlin. I'll leave you with that image. For a contemporary reader, Sansevero's apologetic letter remains an enigma. No doubt the variety, ingenuity, craftsmanship, and beauty of the quipu, which you saw depicted in Sansevero's book, are extraordinary. As in traditional Western typography, the art of the quipu, while conveying the meaning of the text it contains, is above all a visual art, and like all writing, born of images. Writing does not reproduce the spoken word, it renders it visible. But the code to that visibility must be shared in the society in which the artist works. Robert Bringhurst says in the introduction to his wonderful typographical handbook, typography thrives as a shared concern, and there are no paths at all where there are no shared desires and directions. From our distant place, we lack the clues to help us understand what those desires and directions were in the Inca Empire. We must assume that the examples of quipu that have come down to us have features that a reader in that society would have been able to identify as distinct from one another. Some graceful, some clumsy, some clear, some blurry, a few distinctly original, and most conventional, if grace, clarity, and originality were qualities that an Inca reader would recognize or care about. A number of recent scholars are of the opinion that Sansevero's proposed syllabic method for reading the quipu was inspired less by the science of linguistics than by the rebus and charades popular in the European press of the 18th century. In France, you still have a game that consists in constructing a word by saying, my first is this, my second is that, ma première, ma deuxième, and so on, trying to break the word in parts and defining the parts as in a charade. These scholars believe that while highly sophisticated, the quipu was no more than a counting system and a mnemonic device such as those used in the Americas from the coast of British Columbia to the tip of the southern Andes. It is true that today in certain parts of Peru, quipu are used exclusively for storing numerical information. But a number of Spanish documents from colonial times tell of the quipu camaya, who using the knots as memory aids could recite lengthy chronicles and poems and thus preserve the documentary memory of past events. In other cultures, poets have used rhyme and alliteration for similar purposes. In the Inca society, the quipu was also an instrument that facilitated the maintenance of order. And I see a relationship between the ordering of a text to memorize and the ordering of laws to preserve order in a society. Pedro Cieza de León in 1553, one of the chroniclers of the Conquista, has this to say: the wars, cruelties, pillages, and tyranny of the Spaniards had been such that if these Indians had not been accustomed to order and providence, they would all have perished. After the Spaniards had passed through, the chronicler continues, the Inca chieftains came together with the keepers of the quipu, and if one had expended more than the others, those who had given less made up the difference, so that all were on equal footing. Typography, says Bringhurst again, is to literature as musical performance is to composition, an essential act of interpretation, full of endless opportunities for insight or obtuseness. That's the Bringhurst quote. Except that in the case of the quipu, we do not know what is revealing and what is obtuse. And the reading, both aesthetic and hermeneutical, must necessarily consist largely of guesswork. Inspired guesswork, perhaps, but guesswork nonetheless. There may, however, be a few clues to understanding something of that to us mysterious, practical, and aesthetic sense that ruled the quipu artisans of the Inca Empire. It is a fact that when the Spaniards sacked the Inca cities, the beautifully crafted golden artifacts that they collected from the royal treasuries and private homes were melted down into ingots for an easier distribution of the loot. And I will end with this. Today, engraved in stone over the door of the Museum of Gold in Santa Fe de Bogota, the visitor can read the following verses addressed by a native poet to his Spanish conquistadores. I am marveled by your blindness and folly, that you undo such lovely jewels and turn them into bricks and stones. Thank you.
I think that perhaps, Mr. Manguel, will you field your own questions?
Sure.
Okay.
Any questions? If you've understood everything, you can explain it to me. Yes?
It seemed like there was a symmetry from how you expressed the invention of writing as providing a way of maintaining order and control, and then that, in fact, being used against the writing through censorship.
Indeed.
Could you say something more about that? About it, writing seeming to defeat itself in the long run that way?
I believe that perhaps every human practice exists in the tension between creating and destroying. That every time we find a way to set something up, we find a way of putting it down. Whether it is a work of art, whether it is a loving relationship, whether it is a society and its government. And so it is with the art of writing, that not only the obvious destruction or intended destruction of censorship, but also in a creative way, whenever a style becomes established or a tendency becomes established in any of the arts, immediately there is a reaction to destroy it. So you have postmodernism succeeding modernism, you have les anciens et les modernes, you have these conflicts, which are creative conflicts. I would say that they want to destroy in order to better build, and language survives in that tension. As soon as you have a language that is officially protected, as soon as you have, as happened in English or happened in French, to say no English words in French or no French words in English, the tendency forces the language to close itself on itself and no longer breathe, no longer continue to grow. In Spanish, the dictionary of the Royal Academy is constantly trying to curb new forms. And it's a useless exercise, because no one speaking in the street or writing her own poetry consults the dictionary of the Academy to say if I can say things this way or that. But this is part of a much faster discussion.
Thanks. Do we know if there was essentially only one language of the quipus, or were the knots sometimes arranged in different types of meaning?
We don't know, but we do know that there were many languages. The Inca Empire was enormous, and as occurs with every empire, there was an official language, and then there were the dozens of languages spoken in different places. What we don't know, or at least what I don't know, is whether the quipus were knotted, not to say written, in these different languages. What I have read seems to assume that they were written in this one official language, much as before the rise of endemic languages in Europe, everything was written in Latin. So not to say that the other languages were not spoken, but the documents were not written in those languages. Yeah.
Thank you. Yeah, lovely talk. Thank you
you
very much. No, thanks to you. I have a question about the aura that's constructed around the 18th century, as you describe it, both in America and in Naples. And it makes me think of that line from Melville, signs taken for wonders. And it seems to me you're bringing us into this, whether it's alchemy or the quipu, or even in the Comentarios Reales, there's a passage where a chasqui,
Yes, a
runner,
messenger.
a messenger runs from one town to another with a piece of paper with writing on it, and they say, "Oh my goodness, it's the talking paper, right? El papel que habla." So I'm kind of wondering. I was very fascinated by the proposal here about the need for language to come on like a punch, the Kafka line, which could also be Roberto Arlt, right? But in any case, I was thinking, what would the punch have been of these quipu for a Neapolitan like Sansevero, who was involved in his own magic and brujaha?
I can't say for various reasons. First of all, because Sansevero's deciphering did not really lead to any legible text. There were words here and there. Garcilaso, as you know, translated some, and we have examples of Inca poetry, but how he read them and what it is that we read, I could not say, and I don't think anyone could. It's very mysterious to know how to go about, for me, how to go about the literature and the language of other cultures, and especially other remote cultures, remote in time. Borges has a wonderful little essay on the Scandinavian metaphors, on the Icelandic metaphors, the Kenningar, which read today are beautiful and surprising. Water of the sword is blood. The swan of the sea is the ship, and so on. But as Borges points out, not knowing about them, we read them as beautiful images. For the audience of the Icelandic poets, these were commonplaces, like speaking of a rainbow. Rainbow, we don't hear the words, the bow in the rain, etc. We just, rainbow, it's just an ordinary word. I wonder whether we are not doing the same even when we can rescue the texts and what we take to be the meaning of these texts. I'm always fascinated by the fact that in the West we love and have been so strongly influenced by the Arabian Nights, and in Arab cultures they are considered the equivalent of pulp fiction. They don't have the prestige of a literary text, which is reserved for philosophy and poetry. So I don't have an answer. Yes?
So this may not actually result in a question, but I'll see if I can figure out a way to make that happen. But it is at least a comment that may follow on from this. The material that you're dealing with would present itself quite readily as the subject for study of linguistics or anthropology.
Absolutely.
But that's not what you're doing.
Well, I can't because I'm not a linguist and not an anthropologist.
But in part because those are basically demystifying approaches. Mm-hmm. And part of the reason it seems to me that you're drawn to the 18th century encounter with this is because that was a moment of fascination around it as much as anything else.
Absolutely.
And I think part of your own approach, which I've been trying to just sort of locate, which is in part aesthetic and in part historical and in part narrative, does involve trying to give us an explanation that also draws us to the fascination of these things. I guess my question is, what do you think?
Well, my only excuse is to say that I am not a scholar, and so I have or I give myself the liberty to be fascinated and not to find or not to really look for an explanation. I'm fascinated by the question. I'm fascinated by the method of Sansevero, which seems to me truly a very valid intellectual method of constructing an intellectual opposition to his theory in order to rebut it. I mean, why would a scholar think that it's necessary to find the text that you rebut when those elements can be set in front of you and then rebutted? I'm reminded of Chesterton again, who loved to debate with Bernard Shaw, and they would always take opposite points of view. And one day, Bernard Shaw did not arrive to the debate, so Chesterton was not fazed. He sat on one side of the table and argued for Bernard Shaw, and then went to the other and argued against him, and so on throughout the evening. I love that kind of intellectual play. And I like in the 18th century the fact of trying to find a rational way of speaking of wonderment. Yeah. Yes.
Actually, I have a very narrow question to follow up on Tony's very large question. And that is, there are lots of moments of translation. I mean, a lot of this just circulates on translating things from the average world to the magical world and back, and questions of perspective. But there was one little moment where you were talking about the story of the woman who was writing these beautiful love letters using the quipu and then having to learn to write. And I'd love to hear more about, is there any kind of fleshing out of that transition to writing? What was the problem for her? How was that framed?
Unfortunately, it's not a very good novel. It's,
she just learned it. And
so, but the idea is so fascinating. She doesn't go into it as she should. I wish that Diderot would have written that novel. But she does present it as a moment where, because you no longer have the tools of communication to which you are accustomed, you have to change not only the method, and you have to learn a new one, but you have to change what you say. And this I find a useful reminder today when we are constantly confronted by the printing technology and the electronic technology. And I think we often forget that while it's commonplace to say that each has its advantages and disadvantages and so on, but we forget up to what point the support of a text, the container of a text, influences the text, not only the reading of it, not only the use we make of it, but the actual significance of the text. That à la recherche read on the screen is not the same as read in a Pléiade edition. And I don't think that, well, Roger Chartier has done quite a bit of writing about this, but it's not been looked into enough, I think, and I feel that it's a very good moment to look into this, since we are using these electronic gadgets. What changes in the text itself? I love a story from one of the apocryphal books of the Bible, the lives of Adam and Eve, which were written, I think, in the 3rd century and then continued in dozens of languages all the way into the 9th and so on. And it's a lovely postmodern story because it's the story of Adam and Eve, their life, and then at the end, Adam dies. And then at the end, you find out that the story is being written by Eve's son, Seth. And Eve says at the end of the book, Seth, you have to write the biography of your parents, and which is what you have just read. It's a nice circular device. But what Eve tells Seth, and this is what interests me, she says, you have to write it twice. You have to write it on wood, and you have to write it on stone. Because if the Lord ends the world by fire, the stone will survive. And if he ends it by water, the wood would survive. And this is something that I think we should remember, that not only to back up our texts electronically, but to have them in all these different supports that are available to us, because they are different. They survive differently. Yes?
When you mentioned... When you mentioned the little essay by Borges, I thought you were going to refer to the analytical language of John Wilkins. and I thought of it during your talk when you mentioned the Kipu word for the ostrich, the South American ostrich. So and I had this image of all of life fitting on one Kipu thread that would get longer and longer or shorter and shorter for each species and animal. And I just wonder if in your thinking about this, you've returned to that essay of Borges.
Unfortunately, I return too often to that essay, and I try very hard when I sit down to write to not to think about him, because he infects everything. But it is a wonderful essay. I hadn't thought of it in relationship to this. It occurred to me that this idea of writing about something that doesn't exist, and so presupposing the existence of this novel text to which you write a foreword, or you do a review, or you write about the writer, is a very Borgesian device that Sansevero uses. But I hadn't thought about his lists, which is a wonderful conceit. An anecdote, I was reminded of an anecdote that Borges would have liked. Colette was friends with Paul Masson, who worked at the Bibliothèque Nationale on the catalogue. And he was at her place by the sea one day, and she saw that he was writing cards for the catalogue. And she said to him, "You have such a wonderful memory to be able to catalogue books that you don't have in front of you." And he said to her, "Well, these are books that the library doesn't have but should have. So I'm filling in the blanks." She said, "Well, but will you write those books afterwards?" And his answer was, "Well, I can't do everything." Yes?
If I could ask another question. I'm curious to know whether there was a system for numbers in the Kipu. Mm-hmm. In part because, well, it would be interesting to know what it was like, but also because you played with this notion of accounting. Yes. A number of times, and some of the early languages that we know of, like cuneiform, were very directly connected with matters of accounting.
Yes, in spite of our wishful thinking, our first writers were accountants
Yeah,
and not
right,
poets.
right. So what was it like to...
I don't know enough about it, but many scholars suggest that the Quipus were not writing at all, but simply a counting device, mathematical writing. I know that the system was binary, and but I don't understand, because I don't know enough about mathematics, why it could not go further than 10,000. It reached 10,000 and it started again. So you had 10 lots of 10,000 to say 100,000. But that the quipus, the knots, represented then combinations in the binary system. But I simply don't know enough about it. Now, I had a question for Paula. I wondered if you could compare the writing of quipus with the writing of classical Chinese.
Actually, I was thinking more of comparing Sansevero to Ezra Pound's view of classical Chinese.
Yes.
There's the Qipu don't see. There is a mythology in ancient China that one of the many myths about the origins of language talk about it beginning with the sages writing by tying knots. But it's a myth, and there isn't any further exploration of the reality. There have been no archaeological finds to confirm.
No, I wondered about the theory that the Qipu constructs a symbolism of color that represents certain things that you then deconstruct in order to construct another one. And I wondered if it had a relationship with Chinese signs that I don't.
There is one. I don't know about that aspect of it, but there is the combination of the phonetic with what you term the hieroglyphic is definitely present in a large number of Chinese characters. That is actually something upwards of 80% of Chinese characters are considered phonetic. That is, they're made up of radicals, and there will be one radical in there that will give you a rough indication of what phoneme it is associated with, but you could never look at a character and know how to pronounce it necessarily. You just know generally the category. Then there'll be other radicals in there that will tell you what matter of object or thought category it belongs to. But what's very interesting is Ezra Pound basically claiming that every single Chinese character embodied an entire thought process, basically the manifestation of transformations in the world itself, and that as if Chinese poets were thinking that way when they selected an individual character. And there is actually a Chinese scholar poet who left China in the early 50s and became friends with Julia Kristeva and was enamored of semiotics. And he went and wrote a book called Chinese Poetic Writing, L'écriture poétique chinoise, which is a wonderful book that actually does a semiotic analysis of classical Chinese poetry, but then the last part of the book, he basically does a Poundian analysis of the characters. And for this, he was taken to task by everybody. So that was part of his proselytizing, I think. He wanted the French to feel attracted by and interested in Chinese poetry. And so he actually revived that way of looking at the language, at the writing, which is really not the way that, it's more like what you were saying about rainbow. You know, it's a rainbow. Yeah, it's a word.
Well, thank you very much. Thank you.